The phone rang at 7 in the morning, and Claire Moreau did not answer it. She was standing at the kitchen window with a mug of tea going cold in her hand, watching a pigeon attempt to dismantle a chip from the pavement outside, and she had already decided the call could wait. It could wait, because she had 7 things to do before 9, because her daughter Lily needed her lunch packed, because the boiler was making a sound it had not made last week, and because whoever was calling at 7 in the morning was almost certainly going to ask her to do something that would make the rest of her day harder than it already was. She was right. She found out later it was her cousin Oliver, and what he needed to tell her was the kind of news that people deliver as if they are dropping something fragile, with both hands extended and a look of nervous apology. He called again at 7:15. She answered on the 3rd ring. He said yes, Oliver told her, without greeting or preamble, in the specific way people deliver news they have been sitting on too long. I told him it was casual. I told him it was just a family dinner. Nothing formal, nothing big. He said yes. Claire set the mug down on the counter. The pigeon had won its argument with the chip.
He said yes.
She said.
He did.
A pause. Outside on the pavement, a second pigeon arrived, and the first one left immediately, which she found interesting. All right, she said. All right, that is all you have to say? Oliver, it is 7 in the morning. I know what time it is. Then you know I need coffee before I have reactions. She heard him exhale hard on the other end. The exhale of a man who has been holding something for too long, and is only partly relieved to have said it. Oliver was 31 years old, and had been her closest cousin since they were children, climbing through their grandmother's kitchen window after midnight to steal the end of a baguette. He was nervous now in the specific way she recognized, the way he got before anything that mattered to him, in a way he was not sure he was allowed to show. He is going to come with his full thing, Oliver said. You understand that. He is not going to show up in a normal car wearing something ordinary. He is going to make it into an event. Let him, Claire said. Claire. Let him make it an event. We will have dinner. He will eat grandmother's lamb. He will sit in the chair with the wobbly leg, and then he will go home. A longer pause. You are not nervous at all, Oliver said, and it was not quite a question. I did not say that, she said. She hung up and stood in the kitchen for another minute, watching the second pigeon accomplish what the first one had already accomplished. The boiler made its noise. Her daughter Lily appeared in the doorway in her school uniform, with one sock on and one sock in her hand, and asked if Mum had seen her other one, and the morning took everything forward with it, the way mornings reliably do. The man Oliver had called about was named Edmund Hartley, not simply Edmund Hartley. He was the 4th Duke of Aldenmere, a title that reached back nearly 200 years, and which sat on his shoulders, the way things sit on people who were born carrying them, which is to say, with a kind of invisible ease, that the carrier has completely forgotten is there. He owned a country estate in Wiltshire that had been in his family for 6 generations. He owned paintings that 3 museums had contacted him about borrowing. He held a membership at a private club in London, where the waiting list for new members was currently running at 12 years, not because the club was particularly exclusive in any modern sense, but because people who belonged to it tended to stay until they could no longer physically arrive, which meant vacancies were infrequent. He was 54 years old, silver at his temples, slim in the way that people who have never had to be worried about food tend to be slim, and he was, by every measure his world recognized, one of the most significant people in any room he entered. That last part was the issue. Not the estate, not the paintings, not the 12-year waiting list. The issue was the most important person in any room. Edmund Hartley had been the most important person in rooms for so long that he had lost track, somewhere in the decades, of what it felt like when the room did not tilt toward him. He had forgotten that rooms had other people in them, who had other centers of gravity, other histories, other weights. He was not a cruel man. That was important to understand. He was not deliberately dismissive or intentionally belittling. He was simply a man who had moved through the world at such a consistent and comfortable altitude for such a very long time that the ground below had become theoretical. He had met Oliver 6 weeks earlier at a charity fundraiser in Kensington. Oliver worked in architectural conservation, and Edmund's estate needed exactly that kind of professional attention, so the meeting had started as business. But Oliver was warm and easy, and had a quality of making every conversation feel like the best one happening in the building at that moment. And Edmund, who spent the majority of events in a state of managed obligation, had ended up in a corner near the drinks table with Oliver for nearly an hour. Oliver had mentioned his family in the generous, uncalculated way he always mentioned things he loved. Edmund had been politely curious. Oliver had talked about Sunday dinners, about his grandmother's kitchen, about the noise of the house and the food, and the way 15 people around a table became its own kind of weather. He had said, almost in passing, that Edmund should come sometime. "It is not fancy," Oliver had said. "It is the opposite of fancy, but the food is extraordinary." Edmund had smiled and said that sounded wonderful. He had not expected to be held to it. Oliver, however, was a person who took his own invitations seriously. 3 weeks later, the dinner was in Edmund's calendar, written by his own hand, which was not something he did for everything. He mostly forgot about it in the way he forgot about things that were not immediately pressing. His week filled itself, as his weeks always did, with the work of being Edmund Hartley, a meeting with his estate manager about the south wall, a dinner at the House of Lords, a long call with his solicitor about a property boundary dispute that had been proceeding for 4 years without visible progress, a reading of correspondence that took most of Thursday morning, the Sunday dinner with Oliver's family, in East London, at a house he had never been to, was not the largest item on the list. But he did not cancel. He almost did on the Thursday, when his secretary left him a reminder, and he read it and held the pen over the reply space for a full 30 seconds before deciding to keep it. Something he could not precisely name had stopped him. Perhaps it was the fact that the last 4 events he had attended were, in their essential texture, identical. The same rooms, the same conversations moving across the same topics, with the same careful avoidance of anything that might actually challenge anyone. He was tired, in a way he did not usually let himself admit, the tiredness of a man who has been performing familiarity for so long that he can no longer locate the version of himself that does not perform. He kept the dinner. He told his driver the address. He chose what he believed was an appropriately modest suit, which was still a suit that cost more than most households spent in a month. He arrived at the Moreau house at 12:30 on a Sunday in October, when the sky was doing the flat white thing it does in autumn when it cannot decide between cloud and clarity. The street was narrow and lined with cars on both sides. There were children somewhere nearby, the sound of them moving over the rooftops and under the gutters, the way children's sounds travel on quiet streets. The house itself was mid-terrace, 2 floors, a swept front garden with a pot of orange flowers, near the door, that were still doing their best against the advancing cold. It was not what he was used to. He stood on the pavement for a moment and looked at it. His driver, a man named George who had worked for Edmund for 11 years, and who had driven him to more varied destinations than either of them could easily count, caught his eye in the rearview mirror and said nothing. George was exceptionally good at saying nothing. Edmund straightened his jacket and walked to the door and knocked. The door opened before his knuckle had fully dropped back. A boy of about 10 stood in the doorway. He had what appeared to be jam on his chin, was holding a toy car in one hand, and was looking at Edmund with the complete, unself-conscious frankness that children have before they learn what things are supposed to mean. "Are you the Duke?" the boy asked. Edmund said, "I am." The boy considered this for a moment, with what appeared to be mild interest rather than anything more significant. "Oliver said you were coming. Do you want to come in?" "Thank you," Edmund said. The boy stepped aside, and Edmund stepped into the hall, and the door of the house closed behind him, and everything changed at once in a way that was entirely physical. It was warm, immediately and noticeably warm, the kind of warmth that comes from a house that has had many people in it for several hours. There were coats on every hook of the rack by the door, and 2 more draped over the banister. There were small trainers on the mat, and a pair of adult boots beside them. From somewhere deeper in the house came 3 or 4 conversations happening at the same time, laughter moving between them, and from the kitchen at the back came a smell that stopped Edmund mid-step, mid-thought, mid-everything. The burrito was cold, something slow and rich and patient, the smell of food that has been cooking since morning, that has gone past cooking into something else entirely, into that register where it is less about heat and more about time. It hit him below thought, below manners, in the part of a person that is older and simpler than everything they have learned. The boy had gone, having completed his responsibility, absorbed back into the noise of the house. Edmund stood in the hall for a moment, entirely alone. Nobody came out to receive him. Nobody announced him. The house simply continued being itself around him, all of its energy and warmth and noise moving on its established currents, as if he had always been part of it, or as if it did not particularly matter whether he was. He took his coat off. He looked for a hook. Every hook was occupied. He folded the coat over his arm and walked toward the sound. The front room was full in the comfortable way. Not crowded, but alive. 2 women on the sofa, one older, and one perhaps late 30s, deep in a conversation that did not pause when Edmund appeared. 3 men near the window, one of them Oliver, who saw Edmund immediately, and crossed the room to him with his hand out, and his whole face lit up. "You came," Oliver said, gripping his hand. "I said I would. I know, but..." Oliver grinned in a way that was too unguarded to be social. "You actually came." He took Edmund's coat without asking, laid it over the back of a chair with a casual efficiency that made Edmund wince very slightly, and began making introductions with the speed of a man who has decided nobody should feel like a stranger for longer than 30 seconds. The women on the sofa were his Aunt Diane and her daughter Priya, who was perhaps 35, and had the watchful eyes of a person who processes things quietly. The 3 men near the window were Oliver's Uncle Gerard, a compact man with thick hands and a direct gaze, and 2 of Gerard's friends, Frank and Pete, who were there in the easy way that friends of family end up at family dinners, through no traceable chain of invitation but with complete acceptance on all sides. There was a teenager in the corner armchair named Nathan, who acknowledged the introduction with a nod while looking at his phone, which was the most that could reasonably be expected. Edmund shook hands and said appropriate things. He was very good at the first 10 minutes of any new room. 40 years of social obligation had made this particular skill almost involuntary. Then Oliver said, "And this is my grandmother." And something in the room shifted. She was in a chair near the fireplace that was clearly and entirely hers, the kind of chair in the kind of house that has always belonged to one specific person, so thoroughly that everyone else simply arranges themselves around it without discussion. She was perhaps 80, perhaps older, with white hair pinned back and eyes that were, as Claire had described them to Lily once, the color of river water when it means business. She was wearing a dark blue dress and low shoes, and her hands were folded in her lap, and she was looking at Edmund Hartley with a stillness that was absolute and which he was not, he found, prepared for. "Grand-mère," Oliver said. "This is Edmund Hartley." "I know who he is," she said, in English, with a French edge that had survived 60 years in this city without softening. "Sit down, young man. You are making the room feel formal." Edmund sat. He could not have said afterward why he did it without a pause. He was not in the habit of sitting when directed. He was considerably more accustomed to others sitting when he indicated they might. But the way Odette Moreau said it was not an order and was not a request. It was simply a fact about what the room required, and she was sharing it with him. And something in his body acknowledged this before his manners had a chance to intervene. Her name was Odette Moreau. She had come to England from Lyon at the age of 22, with her husband, 40 pounds, 1 suitcase, and a recipe for lamb shoulder that her own mother had taught her on a Wednesday afternoon. Neither of them had known it would be the last cooking lesson they would share. She had raised 4 children in this country. She had buried her husband here. She had watched her grandchildren arrive and watched them grow, and had sat in this chair, in this room, in this house, for 31 years. She had had mayors and doctors and teachers and plumbers and artists and deliverymen through her dining room. She had fed them all the same lamb. She had watched them all from the same chair, with the same river water eyes. She had a way of looking at people that had nothing whatsoever to do with what they were called, or what they wore, or how they arrived. She was looking at Edmund Hartley now with this look, and he did not know it, and so he sat under her gaze with the slight and involuntary straightening of a man who is being assessed, and knows it, and cannot identify the criteria. "Oliver tells me you have a house in the country," Odette said. "An estate, yes," Edmund said. "In Wiltshire. It has been in my family for..." "A house," she said, pleasantly. "In the country." A small pause. "Yes," Edmund said. Across the room, near the doorway that led to the kitchen, a woman appeared who had not been there a moment before. She was in her mid-30s, dark hair pulled back in a way that suggested it had been done quickly and without concern for how it looked. wearing a gray knitted jumper and dark trousers. She was drying her hands on a dish towel as she came through the door, and she did a fast, practical survey of the room, the way a person surveys a situation they are responsible for, registering what was where, and what was needed, and who was who. Her eyes landed on Edmund briefly, held for one beat, then moved on. 5 minutes, she said to the room. General and efficient. Everyone should be finding a seat. Oliver caught Edmund's eye. That's Claire, he said, my cousin. She has done most of the cooking. She has been in that kitchen since 9 this morning, Diane said from the sofa, with the particular warmth of someone who deeply appreciates effort that is not their own. Claire had gone back through the doorway. Edmund looked at the empty space she had left in it for a moment. The smell from the kitchen had grown stronger. He had eaten at Michelin-starred restaurants in 4 countries. He had had private dinners prepared by chefs who were significant people in their own fields. He had been to tables in Lyon and Florence and Madrid, where food was treated as a serious event, attended to with ceremony, and the specific reverence of places that know their own quality. He told himself it was only the hunger of the morning and the warmth of the house that made the smell coming from Claire Moreau's kitchen feel, at that moment, like the most promising thing he had encountered in recent memory. He told himself that. The table was in the back room, which opened through a glass door onto a small garden that was dark with October. The table itself had been extended with a leaf to fit everyone, and was covered with a cloth that was clean and slightly too large, its edges draping onto the chairs at the corners. The chairs were different from each other in height and age and material, clearly gathered over years from different rooms and different occasions, each one its own slight history. There were glasses at every place, and a jug of water, and a bottle of wine that had been opened and set in the center like something being claimed. Edmund sat between Oliver and Frank. Across from him was Sophie, perhaps 20, who had the nervous energy of someone at their first grown-up table. Nathan was next to her, phone down now, looking around with slightly more investment than before. Odette was at the head. She did not sit until everyone else had found their place. When she sat, the room settled around her the way a compass settles to its direction. Claire came from the kitchen carrying a large dish that steamed. She set it down in the center. She went back for bread. She came back again, with a bowl of greens, dressed in something with vinegar and sharpness. She moved quickly, efficiently, without making theater of any of it. She sat down last, 2 seats from Edmund at his end of the table. He looked at the lamb. It was on the bone, falling apart at its edges, dark with slow cooking, surrounded by root vegetables that had absorbed the liquid and gone soft and deep. He had seen food presented with considerably more architecture. He had had dishes arrive under glass domes and on heated stone. None of it had produced what this dish produced, which was the simple, clean hunger of a person who is in the right place, at the right time, in front of the right thing. "Help yourself," Odette said, and the table moved. The next 20 minutes were the comfortable chaos of a table that knows how to eat together. Dishes circled, wine poured, bread torn and passed. Frank knocked his fork off the edge, and it was retrieved without event. Nathan asked for the bread 3 times. Sophie told a story about something at her university that made Frank laugh so suddenly, he sloshed his water, and then laughed harder at that. Edmund served himself, and ate, and the lamb was, without debate, the best thing he had eaten in at least a year, possibly considerably longer. It was seasoned with the absolute confidence of someone who had made this dish so many times they had long since stopped measuring anything. He said so. He looked toward the kitchen doorway and then found Claire's eye instead, 2 seats down, and said, with the genuine quality that even very practiced people sometimes produce, "This is remarkable, truly." Claire looked at him with a directness that was not unfriendly, but was not arranged to reassure him either. "Thank you," she said. "It is grandmother's recipe. I followed it." "She followed it for 6 hours," Oliver said. Claire shrugged once, minimal. "Some things take as long as they take." Edmund nodded, in the way he nodded when a thing was worth storing. He turned back to his plate. Frank was beginning a story about a job in Tottenham. The table was warm and full of noise, and the wine was exactly right, and the lamb was the finest thing Edmund Hartley had eaten in longer than he cared to calculate. It did not occur to him, sitting there in that first warm half-hour, that this dinner would become the one he thought about for months. Not because of the food. Because of what happened when the plates were still being cleared, and he said what he said in the easy, comfortable way of a man who has always said things like it in rooms where it always landed the same way. It did not occur to him that this room was not that kind of room. The table had settled into its second phase by the time the meal was properly over. Oliver had taken plates to the kitchen and come back. Frank and Gerard had refilled their wine. Nathan had eaten enough to move from hunger into the more expansive territory of someone who is now thinking about conversation. Sophie had relaxed visibly, her shoulders down, her voice fuller. The conversation had drifted, as conversations at good tables drift, through several different topics without steering, touching on a planning dispute Gerard knew about, a house Frank was working on, something in the news about a building in the city that Oliver had opinions on. It had the natural movement of a table that is not performing conversation, but simply having it. Edmund was comfortable, genuinely comfortable, which was not his usual state at dinner tables he had not been to before. There was something in this room that had the quality of not requiring anything of him beyond being present, and being present was something he did not often get to simply do. He was aware, distantly, that this was because nobody at this table was particularly interested in what he was. They were, variously, interested in what he said, and how he said it, and whether it was interesting, which was a different thing. Diane had engaged him earlier about a conservation project he was familiar with. Frank had asked him an intelligent question about historic building materials. Even Nathan had looked up when Edmund said something about the estate's Victorian-era water system, because Nathan, it turned out, wanted to study engineering, and the question of old water systems was actually interesting to him. He had been talked to as a person, not as a duke. He noticed this. He also noticed that the person he kept noticing was Claire Moreau. Not in a way he would have been comfortable naming. More the way you notice a particular quality of light in a room, or the way a particular piece of music has a line that keeps arriving when you expect something else. She moved through the space of the afternoon with a quality of certainty that was not loudness and not performance. She knew where she was. She knew these people. She knew this house. And she had a way of being entirely present to whoever she was talking to, that made the person she was talking to feel that the conversation they were in was the most worth having. He watched her listen to Sophie for several minutes. Sophie was talking about her university and something she was working on, and Claire was listening with the specific quality of attention that is rarer than it sounds, the kind that does not wait for its own turn, but actually receives what is being given. Sophie, who had been nervous 2 hours ago at a table full of strangers, was now talking with the ease of someone who felt she was worth listening to. Edmund looked away. Frank had turned to him with something about the Victorian terrace in Hackney, the ceiling joist problem that had turned out to be engineering both elegant and necessary, and Edmund pulled his attention back and they talked about buildings for 20 minutes, in a way that was genuinely satisfying, trading knowledge without hierarchy. Frank knowing things Edmund did not, and Edmund knowing things Frank did not, and both of them interested in the gap. Then the conversation shifted. It shifted through Frank, to Gerard, to Oliver, to the general territory of housing and development and planning, the kind of civic topic that opens at dinner tables, the way certain doors open in old houses, easily and without warning. Oliver said something about a development he had read about in the local paper. Gerard had a view on the council. Frank mentioned something about the neighborhood changing. And Edmund, who had been listening and following the thread, and who had views on urban development that he had expressed many times in many rooms without incident, joined the conversation. "The difficulty," Edmund said, setting his glass down with the calm authority of a man who believes he is sharing a considered analysis, is that communities and areas undergoing development often resist the change, which is understandable at a personal level, but it is not realistic as policy. Progress requires disruption. Areas that dig in against development are often the ones that need it most. They simply cannot see that from the inside looking out. He said it pleasantly. He said it as a reasonable observation, the kind he had offered at many tables and in many meetings, and which had always been received as the sensible broad-view thinking of someone who was used to looking at large pictures. He did not hear, as he said it, that what he had just done was tell several people at this table that their community's fight against being changed by forces outside it was a failure of imagination. He did not hear this because he was not listening for it. Frank nodded slowly, not the nod of agreement, the nod of a man deciding something. Gerard looked at the table. Oliver looked at his plate. Odette continued eating. Edmund, reading the table in the way he had been trained to read tables, which was to say in the way of a man who expected rooms to orient toward him, read the silence as consideration. He read it as the attention of people weighing what he had said, finding it sound, preparing to agree. He continued. It is the same across many things, really, he said. People who come from working backgrounds have a very immediate relationship with what is in front of them, which is entirely logical. That is what their lives require. But it does make it harder to take the longer view, the wider vantage. Policy tends to look different from above. He reached for his wine. 2 seats to his left, Claire Moreau put her fork down. Not loudly, not as a statement. She placed it on the plate with the careful precision of a woman who is putting one thing down in order to pick up something else. She looked at Edmund. He had not been looking at her when he said it. He was addressing Frank, who had been the anchor of this thread. But something in the temperature of the table had shifted, the way temperature shifts in a room when a window opens, and he became aware of it, and turned his head toward the shift, and found her eyes already on him. She said nothing yet. She simply looked at him with the expression of a woman who has heard this kind of thing before, who has heard it in different forms from different mouths in different rooms, who has already decided, somewhere quiet inside herself, what she intends to do about it now that it has arrived at her own table. Edmund held her look for a moment. He was trying to locate the source of what he was reading in her face. He thought perhaps he had phrased something poorly. He thought perhaps his tone had been off. He was not yet thinking about the content, about what the words themselves had actually said and to whom. More bread, Oliver said, to everyone and no one. His voice had the careful neutrality of a man who is hoping bread will help. The table took a breath. Claire picked up her fork. She went back to her plate. Edmund turned back to Frank and said something about planning law, and the conversation moved forward, carrying underneath it something that had not yet risen to the surface, but which was there, moving in the current below, making its way toward the moment when it would. Outside the window, the small garden had gone from gray afternoon to early dark. Inside, the table was still warm, the wine was still good, and something had started that neither of them had introduced by name yet. Oliver was the one who started clearing the plates, because he was always the one who started clearing the plates. He had a physical restlessness that made him incapable of sitting still once the purpose of eating had been accomplished, and he began stacking dishes with the practiced efficiency of a person who has done this at this table since childhood. Sophie stood to help. Nathan refilled his water. Frank pushed his chair back and stretched his legs, the satisfied movement of a man who has eaten well and knows it and is in no particular hurry to stop knowing it. Edmund remained in his chair. This was not something he thought about. He had never, in any house he had visited as a guest, cleared plates or carried dishes. There had always been someone else who did this, not because he had arranged it, but because the rooms he moved through had arrangements built into them, structures of hospitality in which his role was to be present and receive, not to carry and return. He sat with his wine and watched the table reorganize itself around the end of the meal. The conversation had fragmented slightly, which is what conversations do when people begin to move. Frank was saying something to Gerard. Sophie and Nathan had a separate thread going. Oliver came and went from the kitchen, his voice audible from there, asking where something was kept. Odette sat at the head of the table without moving. She had been at this table for the lunch hour and the better part of the afternoon, had watched everyone eat and talk and settle and expand into the warmth of the day, and she had not moved significantly in all that time. She held the chair the way she always held it, as its own center of gravity. Edmund looked at her. He wanted to say something. He was not sure what. "Your granddaughter," he started, and Odette turned her eyes to him. "She is a very skilled cook." "She is skilled at many things," Odette said. "The cooking is not the most interesting of them." "Oliver mentioned she has her own business," Edmund said. "She does." He waited for more. More did not come. Odette looked at him with the patience of a woman who has spent a long lifetime not filling pauses for people who needed to sit in them. He tried again. "What kind of business is it?" "The kind she built herself," Odette said. "You could ask her directly." From the kitchen came the sounds of conversation and water and the movement of dishes, and underneath all of it, Claire's voice, low and efficient, asking Oliver something specific and practical about a pot. Edmund looked at his wine glass. He was thinking, in a way he did not usually find himself thinking at social gatherings, which was carefully and without performance. There was something about this afternoon that had the quality of being real, in a way that most of his afternoons were not. He could not locate the precise difference. It was partly the food, and partly the warmth, and partly the fact that nobody in this room had treated him, all afternoon, with the particular quality of deference he had come to regard as normal, and which, he was now dimly aware, he had been treating as a kind of weather he moved through without examining. Frank turned back to him from his conversation with Gerard. "You have a long drive back?" Frank asked. "Not too long," Edmund said. "Mayfair." "Ah. Easy enough then." Frank said it without any quality of performance in either direction. It was simply information about where Edmund lived. Frank looked at him with the comfortable directness of a man who does not arrange his opinions by geography. "You mentioned the building in Wiltshire earlier. Old place, is it?" 1741, the main structure, Edmund said, and the conversation settled into something he was very good at, which was talking about the estate. He talked about it with more openness than he usually managed in more formal settings, because Frank asked questions that were practical rather than deferential, and because the afternoon had done something to Edmund that he had not yet named, but which had loosened him somewhere. They talked about stone and water ingress, and the specific problem of roof lines on Georgian buildings, and subsidence, and the long cost of old things. Frank listened with genuine attention, and contributed from his own experience of working on Victorian buildings, and Edmund found that he was not performing expertise, but simply sharing it, one person to another, which was not the way he typically got to have conversations about his own home. The cheese arrived. Gerard had found it somewhere, and was setting it out with the enterprise of a man who has decided the afternoon is not finished, and intends to see it properly through. Nathan looked at the cheese, with calculated interest. Sophie appeared from the kitchen doorway, and sat back down. Oliver came and went again, now with a plate of something sweet that turned out to be a cake their grandmother had made 2 days before, and which he set in the center of the table, with the air of a man delivering good news that requires no further announcement. "Is that grandmother's walnut cake?" Diane said. "Evidently," Oliver said. "Oh good," said Diane, with the sincere feeling of someone who has been hoping for this. Odette made a small sound of acknowledgement from her chair. Edmund looked at the cake, and then, because he had been not quite managing to not look in that direction all afternoon, he looked at Claire, and found that she was already looking at him, not with anything particular in her expression, not with the measuring look from earlier. Simply the look that happens when two people at a table reach the same point of looking at the same time. He looked away, he cut himself a piece of cheese, he ate it. He listened to Frank tell the end of the ceiling joist story, which finished with a solution so simple it was elegant, and he laughed with genuine appreciation. The afternoon wore on. The candle in the middle of the table burned down a little. Nobody hurried. Edmund Hartley was not in a hurry to be anywhere else. This surprised him, because he was almost always in a hurry to be somewhere else. Not necessarily somewhere better, just different. The next thing, the next room, even evenings at his estate, which he had spent his whole life being told were the point of having an estate, had a hollow quality when he was there alone, which was most of the time. The rooms were large and quiet, and full of beautiful things that asked nothing of him but maintenance. Here, nobody was asking anything of him, and yet the room felt full of something. He sat in it, and recognized the feeling, slowly, and without being entirely sure he trusted it, as ease. But the conversation was not finished with him yet. It had moved, the way conversations move, from one tributary to another, and it had arrived in the territory where Edmund had already waded in once, and now it was back, and it was different this time, because it was Sophie driving it, not him. Sophie was a person who thought seriously, and who, having encountered an idea, could not let it settle until she had turned it all the way around. She had been at a lecture at her university the previous week about social mobility, about the documented relationship between the circumstances you are born into and the circumstances you can realistically hope to arrive at, and the idea had been moving through her ever since, in the way ideas do when they have disturbed something you thought was settled. "The part that got me," Sophie said, "was the gap between what we say about meritocracy and what the data actually shows. We talk about hard work and ambition and making something of yourself, and those things are real. People do them. But the studies consistently show that the zip code or the postcode you are born in has a predictive relationship with outcomes that is much stronger than most people want to accept. That is extensively documented, Edmund said, because it was true, and because the topic had arrived in his vicinity, and he had opinions about it that he had formed over years of reading and thinking and discussing. Sophie looked at him. So then the question is what to do about it, as individuals, but also structurally. Education, Edmund said. Access to quality schooling, to good networks, to the starting conditions that allow for genuine competition. That is where the lever is. But the system itself tends to advantage people who are already advantaged, Sophie said, with the tenacity of someone who has been thinking about this and has not yet been answered out of it. So if you provide education, but the professional networks are still more permeable for people who attended certain schools, or come from certain backgrounds, or carry certain names through certain doors, then you are improving inputs without changing the architecture. That is true in part, Edmund said, but it can also become a convenient frame that reduces the sense of individual agency. I have seen people from very difficult starting points succeed through ability and determination. It does happen. It happens, Sophie said, but not in proportion to the talent and effort that exists in those starting points. No system is perfect, Edmund said, which was true. It was also a slight pivot, a move away from the sharp point toward the softer middle. He knew as he made the move that he was making it, but the sharp point led somewhere specific if you followed it, somewhere that involved his own position in the structure, the degree to which he had moved through life at altitude not because of exceptional individual merit, but because of who he was when he arrived, and that was a place he did not often go. The thing is, he said, settling back into the tone he used at his club, the survey tone, the view from above. It is easy to identify structural barriers and then feel that they are insurmountable, at which point the narrative of being blocked becomes as significant as the block itself. When people come to believe that the structure has already determined everything, they can stop trying. That is the real risk. The cultural attitude becomes self-limiting. The kitchen was quiet. He had not been paying attention to the kitchen sounds, but now he noticed the absence of them. There is a difference, Sophie said, carefully, between believing the barriers have determined everything and acknowledging that they are real. You can acknowledge the weight of something without giving up on carrying it. Certainly, Edmund said, but I've spent time in communities where the prevailing story is one of being held back, and I wonder sometimes whether the story itself becomes the obstacle more than the actual structural conditions. There was a silence. It was the same silence as the one from earlier in the meal, but heavier now, more density to it, the kind of silence that has more in it than the absence of words. Frank put his glass down with a care that was not about the glass. Gerard stopped the side conversation he had been having. Nathan put his phone face down on the table. And Claire Moreau came through the kitchen doorway carrying a teapot, and she set it on the table, and she sat down in her chair, and she looked at Edmund Hartley with the calm and complete attention of a woman who had just heard the exact thing she expected to hear, and who was now, without any performance of the fact, ready. Sorry, she said, pleasantly. The pleasantness had a quality to it that was precise and not accidental. I caught the last bit. Which communities did you have in mind? I was speaking generally, Edmund said. Not any specific community. Generally, she said. The communities where the story of being held back becomes more of a problem than the actual barriers. Something along those lines. Claire poured herself tea, with the focused attention of someone who is not going to rush the next few minutes. She set the pot down. She looked at him. I grew up 3 doors down this street, she said, not in this house. In the one my grandmother moved to when my grandfather died, because it was cheaper. My mother and father both worked full-time from before I can remember. My father worked nights for 6 years when I was small, 6 nights a week, and he slept during the day when we were at school, and we were not allowed to make noise in the mornings, because he had only been asleep for 3 hours. My mother cleaned offices in the city. Not as an office worker, she cleaned them. Edmund was listening. His wine glass was in his hand, but he was not drinking from it. I worked from 16, Claire said. Not because I had a theory about character building, because we needed the money. I did an accounting qualification over 2 years at night school, while working 30 hours a week and raising Lily, who was 2 at the time. She paused. She looked at him with an evenness that had nothing performative in it. Not anger, not accusation, clarity. So when you described the story of being held back as possibly more of a problem than the actual barriers, she said, I would like to know which story you mean. Because from where I was standing, there were no stories. There were facts. Specific, concrete facts. A rent increase in a particular month that meant we moved to a smaller flat. A school that did not have funding to run the advanced maths program. A job I applied for and was not offered, not because I lacked the qualifications, which I had, but because my name did not match the expectation at the other end of the application form. Edmund said, I understand those are real. I know you understand they are real, she said. I am not asking you to confirm they are real. I am pointing out that calling it a story is a way of making it sound like something people are telling themselves. And it was not a story. It was a Tuesday. It was a great many Tuesdays. The table was absolutely still. Edmund looked at her. He had been looked at by many people in many rooms across 54 years of public and professional life. Boards and committees, solicitors, ministers, journalists, rivals, people who respected him, and people who did not. He had been pressed and challenged and questioned, and on occasion, directly accused of things. He was not a man who was easily unsettled in social situations. But Claire Moreau was looking at him in a way that was different from all of those. She was not performing outrage. She was not raising her voice or addressing the table. She was looking at him with the simple, direct attention of a woman who has said a true thing and is waiting for him to decide what to do with it. The look of a person who has been precise and is comfortable with the precision and does not need anything from him in particular as a result of it. He became aware that everyone at the table was watching him. Not unkindly, not as adversaries. They were watching in the way of people who know this woman well, who have sat at this table with her across many Sundays, who know what she is like when she is being exact and calm and serious, and who were now simply watching to see what the new person in the room was going to do with it. Edmund Hartley held very still for a moment. He was a man practiced at finding the pivot in a difficult conversation, the graceful adjustment that acknowledges without fully conceding, the move to slightly higher ground that lets everyone continue. He found one. You are absolutely right, he said, that the structural facts are real and concrete and should not be reduced to narrative. My point was intended to address collective psychology rather than individual experience. And people like yourself, who have clearly, people like me, Claire said quietly. The pivot had not arrived where he intended. I mean people who have. I know what you mean, she said. You mean exceptions. People who have worked hard enough to get through. And those people are used as evidence that the system works when it is working. She picked up her tea. She took a sip. She set it down. The system did not work for me, she said. I worked for myself. The difference is important, and I know the difference, because I have watched what happens when someone who comes from a different background to mine walks into the same room. Not a better argument, not harder work. They walk in, and the quality of the attention they receive is different from the first moment. Not always dramatically, sometimes very quietly. But it is there, and it compounds. That is not a story that community is telling itself. That is still just a Tuesday. Oliver had appeared from the kitchen at some point during this, and was standing near the doorway holding a dish towel, looking at the ceiling, with the expression of a man experiencing very particular feelings about someone he has loved his whole life. Odette, at the head of the table, had not moved. Her eyes were on Claire. Her expression was the expression of someone watching something they have been expecting, and are glad to see confirmed. Edmund said nothing for a moment. He was a man who had always had somewhere to go in conversations, always had the next move visible, always known where the room was likely to go. He did not know where this room was going. He did not have a move. The lamb was honestly the finest thing I have eaten in Burge. I do not know how long, Frank said, with the volume and timing of a man who has done exactly this before, inserted something warm and true into a space that needed filling. I am completely serious. That was extraordinary. Several people at the table agreed, with visible relief and genuine feeling. The table breathed. The lamp in the corner of the room seemed to warm slightly. Sophie looked at the tablecloth. Nathan looked at the tablecloth. Gerard refilled Frank's glass. Claire picked up the teapot and held it toward the table in the general offer. She did not look at Edmund. She did not look at him either. She was simply present at her table in her grandmother's house, offering tea. Edmund Hartley sat back in his chair and looked at a point on the tablecloth and felt, for the first time in a long time, like a man who had said something wrong in front of people who knew it was wrong and was not going to be rescued from knowing it. He was not rescued. He sat with it. The afternoon went on. The cake was served and the tea was poured, and the afternoon moved into its final register, that particular warmth that comes at the end of a long good day, when nobody is quite ready for it to end, but everyone can feel it concluding. Nathan ate 2 pieces of cake without comment or apology, which was the right thing to do. Sophie was on her second cup of tea. Frank had leaned back in his chair with the settled quality of a man who has been comfortable in his body his whole life, and is comfortable in it now. Edmund ate the cake slowly. It was very good, walnut and a slight honey, dense and not too sweet. He ate it and said nothing for several minutes, and this was not unusual, because the table had fragmented into its smaller conversations again, the way it had all afternoon. Different threads at different ends, and he was at one end and had a conversation available to him if he wanted one, but he did not particularly want one. He was thinking. Edmund Hartley was not often in the position of sitting at a table and thinking in real time about something that had just happened to him, that he had not anticipated. Most of his days proceeded on tracks he had laid or inherited, and the surprises that arrived were mostly logistical. This was not logistical. This was something else. This was the specific and uncomfortable sensation of having said something he believed to be true and reasonable, and having had it returned to him from a direction he could not argue with. Not because the return was brilliant, or because he had no counter-arguments, but because the return had been made out of facts. Specific, named, dated facts. A rent increase. An underfunded maths program. A job application. He had talked about narratives. She had given him facts. He had talked about community psychology. She had given him the precise mechanics of one life. He had said people like yourself, and she had caught it before it had left the air between them, and he had felt it, the error of it, in the moment, and had been unable to prevent it. People like yourself, as if she were a category, rather than a person at a table in her grandmother's house, where he was the guest. He looked at the tablecloth, he looked at the candle, burned low now, its wax pooled at the base of the holder. He looked at the garden through the back glass door, the small dark square of it, and beyond that the suggestion of a fence and the bare arms of a shrub. Frank said something to him, and he responded appropriately. Gerard made a point about something, and Edmund listened and said something that was probably sensible. He was functioning on one level, while on another level he was doing something he did not often do, which was sitting inside an experience that was uncomfortable and not trying to move out of it. She was talking to Sophie again, Claire. She had been talking to Sophie, on and off all afternoon, in what was clearly a continuing conversation, returning to it between other things, picking up the thread each time. Sophie had the quality now that she had not had when she arrived, a kind of settled assurance, like a person who has been reminded of something useful they had temporarily misplaced. He could hear fragments, not enough to follow, but enough to hear the quality of it, the way Claire was talking and the way Sophie was listening, which was with her whole self, the way young people listen when they feel they are being given something real. He was aware that he had been watching Claire intermittently all afternoon, and that he had also been intermittently trying to stop, not because it was uncomfortable, but because he did not entirely understand what it was, and he was cautious about things he did not understand. Odette said his name, Mr. Hartley. He turned to her. She had the cake on a small plate in front of her, and was looking at him in a way he had come to understand, over the course of this afternoon, was simply her way of looking at things, direct and unadorned. "Did you enjoy the afternoon?" she asked. "Very much," he said, and it was entirely true. "Good," she said. She took a small piece of cake and ate it. "Oliver speaks well of you." "He is generous," Edmund said. "He is accurate," she said. "Oliver does not speak well of people he does not think well of. He is affectionate, but he is not dishonest." She looked at Edmund. "He said you were interesting. That is not something he says about everyone." Edmund looked at her. "I am not sure I have been particularly interesting today," he said. Something moved across Odette's face that was not quite a smile, but was in its vicinity. Being interesting does not always mean saying something clever, she said. Sometimes it means being teachable. You found out today whether you are or not. She took another piece of cake. Edmund sat with that. He sat with it the way he had sat with everything this afternoon, which was more patiently and with more honesty than was his habit. Near the kitchen doorway, Claire had stood up to help Oliver carry the last of the cups and glasses through. She moved past the table with the ease of a person in a place they know entirely, and Edmund watched her go, and did not try to not watch her. The afternoon was finishing. He could feel it in the room, the way you can feel weather changing, a shift in the pressure of things. People were beginning to gather themselves, the internal collecting that precedes departure. Diane was looking for her bag. Gerard and Pete had stood and were talking in the closer way of people who were about to leave. Nathan had his phone out again and was typing something. Oliver came back from the kitchen and began the general logistics of farewell, hugging people and making arrangements and doing the warm herding that is the natural function of people who have organized the afternoon. He came to Edmund and shook his hand, and then pulled him into the sideways hug that Edmund received, without awkwardness, which was not a thing he would have predicted about himself an hour earlier. "Come back sometime," Oliver said. "I would like that," Edmund said, and meant it in a way that surprised him. He got his coat from the chair where Oliver had laid it. He put it on in the narrow hall. He was nearly at the door when he heard his name behind him, and turned, and Claire was there in the hall, having come from the kitchen direction, drying her hands on the same dish towel she had carried all afternoon. They stood in the narrow hall, with the coats on every hook, and the small trainers on the mat, and the sound of the house finishing its afternoon behind them. "Thank you for coming," she said. The words were courteous. They were not cold, and they were not warm, in the way that warmth is offered as a gift. They were simply what was true. "Thank you for having me," he said. Then he paused, because he had something he wanted to say, and he was not a man who spoke before he had it, and so he was quiet for a moment while he found it. "And for saying what you said," he added. "Earlier, at the table." She looked at him. "I have sat at a great many tables," he said carefully. "I have had a great many conversations. Nobody has said to me what you said in the way you said it." She waited, not interrupting. "I don't know if that reflects on the rooms," he said, "or on me. Probably both, I expect." "Probably both," she said. She said it plainly, without softening it, and also without any sharpness. Just the fact of it. Usually it is both. He nearly smiled. He did not, because the moment did not call for it, and he understood the moment, but something moved in his face. "Good afternoon," he said. "Good afternoon," she said. He opened the door. The evening came in, cold and clean, the smell of the street and other houses, and the ordinary particular life of this neighborhood, on a Sunday in October. He stepped out. The door closed behind him. The orange flowers in the pot were still there, still doing their best. George had the car waiting. Edmund walked to it, and got in, and sat back against the seat. George said nothing. Edmund looked out the window at the pot of flowers, and then at the street, and then at the October evening, which had gone fully dark while he was inside. "Whenever you're ready," he said. George started the engine, and the car moved out of the narrow street and into the wider road beyond, and the Moreau house fell away behind them, with all its warmth and noise, and its table with mismatched chairs, and its grandmother, who kept a chair that was entirely hers, and its smell of lamb that had been cooking since morning. Edmund sat in the car and said nothing. Outside, couples walked. A boy on a bicycle went past with the concentrated effort of someone learning something they had not yet learned. A bus went by full of people going somewhere. The city did what the city does, which is continue. Edmund rode in silence. Not the silence of an empty mind. The full silence. The kind that has work in it. Monday morning was gray, and the city was already moving when Edmund arrived at his desk earlier than usual, which his secretary noted without comment, because she had worked for him for 8 years, and had learned that commenting on things he had not invited comment on was counterproductive in all directions. He had a letter in front of him that he had started 3 times and abandoned. The wastepaper basket beside the desk held the evidence. He was not writing it to Claire Moreau. He had considered this and put it aside, not because he did not want to say something, but because a letter to a woman you have met once at her grandmother's dinner table is a particular kind of thing, and he was not clear it was a kind he had the right to attempt. What he was writing was something else. Notes. In the way he had written notes at university, when a tutor had told him that the first draft of a thought was the most honest version, and that he should write it before manners arrived and tidied it. He wrote, and stopped, and reread, and wrote again. The notes were not polished. They contradicted themselves in places. There was one sentence that he wrote, and then read back, and felt something he identified as shame, the quiet, specific kind that is not dramatic and does not require an audience. He folded the pages and put them in the top drawer of his desk, which locked, and in which perhaps 4 other things in his life had ever been placed for keeping. His secretary brought coffee. There were 3 calls to return and a meeting at 2, and something from the estate manager about the south-facing wall again, still. He thanked her, and looked at the day and moved into it, because this was what he did. He moved into days. He said the right things in meetings. He handled the solicitor's update on the boundary dispute with his usual level competence. He had lunch with a man he had known for 30 years, and found the conversation comfortable in the way it always was. Comfortable like a well-worn coat. Comfortable like a room you have been in so many times you stop seeing it. At his desk in the afternoon, he pulled the drawer open and looked at the folded pages without unfolding them, and then closed the drawer. He accepted a dinner invitation for 3 weeks hence in Mayfair, at a house he had been to many times, with people he knew well. He went home. His house in Mayfair was quiet, in the particular way that large, well-maintained houses are quiet, which is the silence of rooms that have been professionally attended to, and exist in a state of permanent readiness for a life that happens in them only intermittently. He ate dinner alone, something his housekeeper had prepared, which was very good. He sat afterward in his library with a book he had been reading and did not read it. He thought about a table with mismatched chairs. Not all of it. Not in the round, analytical way he might think about a problem or a situation. He thought about specific things. The chair that did not quite match its companions, that had given him a slight list to the left, all afternoon, and which he had not mentioned, because it had seemed beside the point. The smell of the lamb, and the first hit of it, when he walked into the hall. The way Odette had looked at him, when he said estate, and said a house in the country. The way Frank had genuinely laughed at what Nathan said, and then laughed at himself for laughing. The way Oliver's face had looked when Edmund walked through the door. He thought about what Claire had said. Not the challenge of it, which had been real, the content. The specific items. A rent increase in a particular month. A school without the money for its maths program. A job application with a name that did not match the expectation on the other end. He had heard these kinds of things described before, in reports and committee documents and policy discussions. He had understood them as problems. He had not understood them as Tuesdays, as specific dates in the life of a specific person, as the actual texture of someone's actual week. He had said people like yourself, and he was still sitting with that. He could still hear it. He could hear it accurately enough to understand why it had been wrong, which was because it had reached across the table to a particular woman with a particular history, in a particular house, and placed her in a category, gently, helpfully, as if categories were a useful thing to offer a person about themselves. She had noticed it in the air between them before the sentence had finished. He sat in his library until midnight, not reading, just sitting. The weeks that followed were his usual weeks, which meant they were full. Edmund Hartley's calendar did not have empty spaces in it. It had meetings and lunches and obligations and evenings and the specific ongoing administration of a life that had significant infrastructure. He moved through these things with his usual competence, saying the right things in the right places and managing what needed managing and performing the function of being Edmund Hartley in all the rooms that required it. He did not tell anyone about the Sunday dinner. Not because he was concealing it, simply because there was no one in the flow of his regular life to whom it would have made sense to describe it. His friends and colleagues and associates were people who would have listened with polite interest and then said something appropriate and moved on, and he was not interested in the appropriate response. He wanted to think about it, which meant he had to think about it alone, which was not unusual for him. He had always processed things in private. He thought about it on the drive to Wiltshire, which he made the following Saturday for a weekend meeting with his estate manager about the South Wall project. He thought about it in the car, and then was at the estate, and the house was beautiful in the October light, and there were things to discuss, and he discussed them. In the evening he walked the grounds in the way he sometimes did alone, the long field at the back that sloped toward the tree line, and he thought about it then, standing in the cold with the grass underfoot and the last of the light going from the sky. A house in the country, Odette had said. Not a correction, not in her voice, simply an insistence on the plain version of a thing he had complicated with a word. He had spent his life in the plain version of a thing that other people had complicated for other purposes. The estate, the title, the membership and the connections, and the name. He had not created any of these. He had been handed them, carefully, one generation to the next, and he had accepted them and inhabited them, and had never, he was now aware, given sustained thought to what it felt like from the other side of them. Not genuinely. Not with the specific willingness to follow the thought all the way to where it actually ended. He stood in the cold field and looked at the house from across its own grounds, the bath stone face of it going warm in the last light, and he thought, I did not earn this. He had known this, in the abstract. Everyone who inherits anything knows it in the abstract. But abstract knowing and felt knowing are different things, and what he had in the cold field on the Saturday evening after the Sunday dinner was the felt version, which arrived with a kind of weight that the abstract had never had. He went back inside. He had dinner. He slept badly. He drove back to London on Sunday morning, and the motorway was quiet, and the trees were bare now along the edges of the road, October finishing its work. At the office on Monday, he pulled the drawer open and took the folded pages out and read them. They were, as he had expected, not polished. Some of it was embarrassing to read in the way that first drafts are embarrassing. The rawness of thought before it has been made presentable, but there was accuracy in it that he did not want to lose by refining it away. He folded them and put them back. He went to his next meeting. The dinner in Mayfair was on a Thursday evening 3 weeks after the Sunday at the Moroses. Edmund arrived at 8, which was when the invitation said, which was slightly earlier than most people arrived, which was fine, because he knew the house and the hostess well enough to arrive at the time on the invitation. The house was in a white stucco terrace and had been decorated by someone with very specific ideas about what rooms should look like, which meant it looked like what it was, which was an expensive house in Mayfair, belonging to people who had always had one. The rooms were right, the flowers were right, the candles were right. The conversation started immediately in the particular register of these evenings, light and precise, and moving in agreed directions. He knew most of the people there. The exceptions were a young woman called Alice who was at the beginning of some kind of career in the arts, and a man named Charles who ran something significant in international finance, and had the energy of a person who believes they are the most interesting person in most rooms they enter, which in the rooms he typically entered was not inaccurate. The dinner was excellent. The food was prepared by someone whose name was known, and whose skill was real, and who had deployed both in the production of a meal that was beautiful, in the architectural way, each dish a precisely constructed thing, presented with thought. Edmund ate it, and found it very good. He also found, at some point during the second course, that he was comparing it to lamb cooked for 6 hours in a kitchen, 3 doors from where Claire Moreau had grown up, and that the comparison was not doing the dinner any particular favors. He put this aside and paid attention to the table. Charles was talking about something he was involved with, a consortium of some kind, and was doing so with the confidence of a man whose opinions have not been tested by serious opposition in some time. He moved from the consortium to the economy, to policy, and then, with the easy drift of a man who sees connections everywhere, because his position has made him believe that everything connects to his position, to housing. The dependency culture issue, Charles was saying, is the one nobody in government has the nerve to properly address. You can build all the affordable units you like. The structural problem is generational. People grow up with a particular relationship to government support, and they pass it on. It becomes the expectation. Edmund listened. He had heard this said before in versions very similar to this one. He had agreed with versions of it before, or at least had not disagreed, which in rooms like this amounted to the same thing. He looked at his wine glass. He looked at the table. He looked at the correctly placed silverware, and the correctly folded napkins, and the correctly arranged flowers, and the room that was entirely and correctly what it was supposed to be. He thought about a dining room with mismatched chairs, and a cloth that was slightly too large, and wine in a bottle that had been opened and put in the center like a flag. He thought about a rent increase in a particular month, a maths program that could not be funded, a name on an application form. He set his glass down. "I am not sure that is quite right," he said. Charles looked at him, with the expression of a man who is not often contradicted by people whose opinion he has already formed. Edmund said, carefully and without drama, that the relationship between communities and public support was considerably more complex than dependency, as a concept allowed for, and that the framework of generational expectation tended to discount the structural facts that generated those expectations, and that he had recently had reason to examine the distinction quite specifically, and that he thought it was worth being precise about it. He said it in 1 or 2 careful sentences. It was not a speech. It was not a declaration. It was the small beginning of a thread he did not yet know the full length of. Charles said, "Interesting," in the way that people say interesting when they mean "I disagree," but cannot immediately find the counter. He moved the conversation sideways. Edmund let it move. He was not looking for a fight. He was not looking to perform a change of position for the benefit of the table. He was simply, for what he thought might be the first time in a room like this, following a thought all the way to where it ended, instead of stopping where it became uncomfortable. The evening continued. He said other things. He listened to other things. He was, as always, exactly what the room expected him to be, in the ways that mattered, present and engaged and socially competent and exactly himself. But underneath, quietly, the thing from the Sunday dinner was still working. He could feel it the way you feel something healing, a slow process, not without some discomfort, which you have to simply allow to proceed. He went home. His house was quiet and large. He sat in the library. He thought about one sentence. "The system did not work for me. I worked for myself." He thought about it for a long time in the quiet room. He thought that it was probably not the whole picture. He thought there were policy tools that worked, and structures that had genuinely opened, and that the picture was complicated, and that a single sentence was not an entire analysis. He also thought that a sentence does not have to be an entire analysis to be true. Lily Moreau kept a notebook under her bed. She had kept it for 2 years. It was not a diary, which she was specific about if anyone ever asked, which they did not, because it was under her bed. A diary was for feelings. A notebook was for things that seemed important enough to write down, because you thought you would need them again. On the Sunday evening of the dinner, after the guests had gone and the house had settled into the specific quiet of a place that has had a lot of people in it, and is now finding its usual temperature, Lily had sat at the kitchen table with her mother, and the last of the cake, and a glass of milk that she had decided to stop apologizing for, internally, as too young, because it was cold and good, and that was reason enough. "Were you nervous?" Lily asked, "when you talked to him at the table?" Her mother had considered this in the way she always considered things, which was actually, and not just as a performance of considering. She did not say no right away. "A little," her mother said. "Not of him exactly, more of getting it wrong. You only have one chance to say something correctly. If you fumble the delivery, it does not matter if the content is right." "You did not fumble it," Lily said. "No," her mother said. "I do not think so." "Were you angry?" Her mother looked at the table for a moment. "I was something," she said. "Not quite angry. More like someone who has been carrying something for a long time and has finally reached the place where they can set it down." Lily thought about this. She did this with things her mother said, turned them around in her mind, because her mother's things tended to be worth turning. "Did you want him to apologize?" she asked. "No," her mother said. "Not really. An apology in the moment would have been about him, not about what was true. What I wanted was for him to hear it. Whether he did anything with it afterward is his own work." "Do you think he did?" Her mother tilted her head slightly, which was what she did when a question was genuinely uncertain. "I think he heard it," she said. "Whether that turns into anything different, I cannot know. I can only do the part that is mine to do, which is saying the true thing." Her mother looked at her with the eyes that Lily had known her whole life. "Which is saying the true thing," she said. Lily went to bed. She got the notebook from under her mattress. which was where she kept it, because under the bed was too predictable, and she sat up with the bedside lamp on and wrote. She wrote. The system did not work for her. She worked for herself. She told the truth to one person in one room. That is the part that is hers to do. The rest is theirs. She read it back. She thought it was right. She put the notebook back. She turned off the lamp. The room was dark, and the street outside was quiet, with late Sunday evening. In the room next door, she could see the thin line of light under the door where her mother was at her desk, going over numbers for the business. The lamp made its small warm circle in there. The rest of the house was dark and still. Lily lay on her back and looked at the ceiling, and thought about the man with the good suit and the very expensive car outside, who had come for Sunday dinner, and had not expected to be talked to the way he had been talked to. She thought he probably drove home in his expensive car feeling a lot of things. She hoped some of them stayed. She went to sleep. Odette Moreau had a way of knowing things, not in any mysterious sense. In the very practical sense of a woman who had watched people across a table for 80 years, and who had learned, somewhere in those 80 years, that what people say, and what they mean, and what they will do, are three different measurements of the same thing, and that only one of them matters in the end. She had watched Edmund Hartley across her table all afternoon. She had watched him the way she watched everyone who came to the table, with the specific attention that did not require her to stare or lean or ask questions. She watched in the way of a woman who has been very still in many rooms for a very long time. She had seen him arrive with the thing he always carried, the altitude, the comfortable assumption of a man who has always been the weight in the room that everything else arranges around. She had seen it in the way he stood at the door, waiting for the room to come to him. She had seen it in the small adjustment of his expression when he noticed that it would not. She had watched him listen to Frank about buildings, and seen that the interest was genuine, which mattered. A person who is only performing interest in what other people know is a different kind of problem than a person who has genuine curiosity, but has been living so long at altitude that the curiosity has not been exercised in the direction of the ground. She had watched his face when Claire spoke. She had watched the progression of it, the ease of the first minutes, the slight tightening when he recognized something had gone differently than he expected, the particular expression of a man who is being precise about something and has just been given a reason to reconsider the precision. She had watched him afterward. She had watched him eat the cake slowly and say nothing for a while, which was interesting. Men who are wrong in public and know it tend to either go loud or go silent, and going silent takes something. At the end, when the afternoon was finishing and people were gathering themselves, she had asked him directly whether he had enjoyed the afternoon. She had asked, not because she needed the answer, but because she wanted to see what he did with a simple question. He had said yes, and it had been entirely true. She could hear entirely true things, the way a person who has been listening carefully their whole life learns to hear them, by their absence of performance. She had told him that Oliver had said he was interesting. She had told him that Oliver was accurate. She had said that being teachable was a kind of interest. She had watched to see what he did with that too. He had not dismissed it. He had sat with it. A man who can sit with something he has not resolved is a different kind of man from one who must resolve everything immediately, in his own favor, to feel safe. She did not know whether he would do anything with the afternoon. She did not have expectations about people she had known for 3 hours. But she had a sense, which had rarely been wrong in 80 years of having senses, that the afternoon had done something to Edmund Hartley that he was going to have to work out what to do with. The working out was his. She had done what she always did, which was make the lamb, and set the table, and keep the chair that was hers, and let the afternoon be what it was. She washed her hands in the kitchen after everyone had gone, and Oliver was the last one helping dry the pots, and she said to him, "He is not a lost cause." Oliver looked at her. "Do you think he will change?" Odette dried her hands. "I think he heard her," she said. "The rest is up to him. It usually is." Oliver nodded. He knew this. He had grown up knowing this. The idea that you did the part that was yours, and you let the rest proceed. It was his grandmother's way. It had always been his grandmother's way. "Did you like him?" he asked. Odette considered. "He is not a bad person," she said. "He has been in rooms where no one has told him a true thing for a very long time. That does things to a person." She put the towel down. He also listened. At the end, when he stopped talking, He actually listened. That is not nothing. Oliver agreed that it was not nothing. He drove home later that evening thinking about the afternoon, in the way he thought about things that had gone well but had also been complicated, which was to say with a kind of satisfaction that had some weight in it. He was glad Edmund had come. He was glad Claire had said what she said. He was glad that nobody had made it worse than it needed to be, or better than it was. He was glad his grandmother had her chair. Edmund Hartley went back to the Moreau house once more, 6 weeks later, in December, when the orange flowers had been replaced by a pot of something evergreen that was doing its own kind of best. He had not planned to go back. He had thought about it and decided he would not, because going back felt like something that needed a reason, and he was not sure he had one that would make sense to anyone else. And then Oliver had called and said they were doing another Sunday, and if Edmund wanted to come he was welcome, and Edmund had said yes, before he had thought about whether to say it. He brought wine, a good one but not an ostentatious one. He had thought about this. The house was the same, warm from outside, full from the moment he stepped in, some of the same people, some different ones. Nathan was there again, with a question about Victorian engineering that he asked Edmund directly and without preamble, which Edmund answered with genuine pleasure. Frank was there, who shook his hand and went back immediately to a story he was in the middle of, as if Edmund had simply been in the kitchen and returned. Odette was in her chair. Claire was in the kitchen. Dinner was roast chicken this time, herbs under the skin, roasted all around with the bones of what had been in the pan overnight. It was extraordinary. Edmund sat between Oliver and a man named Alan who turned out to be Diane's husband, back from 3 weeks away somewhere, who had the comfortable solidity of a person very happy to have returned to somewhere he wanted to be. They talked about cities and what it felt like to come back to one after time away, and Edmund found that he had things to say about this that he had not said before, not in those terms, about the estate, and the London house, and the feeling of belonging to two different kinds of place, without feeling entirely of either. Alan listened. That is a strange thing to carry, Alan said. It is, Edmund said, and this was the most honest he had been about his own strangeness in recent memory. At the table, during the meal, the conversation moved as it always moved in this house, through practical and political and personal and funny, not staying anywhere long enough to become anything other than alive. Edmund talked when he had something worth saying, and listened when he did not, and found that the balance was more in favor of listening than he was used to. Claire was across the table from him this time, not 2 seats down, directly across. They talked, not about what had happened at the first dinner, about other things, about Lily, who it turned out wanted to study medicine, which Claire talked about with the particular pride of someone who does not want to overdo the pride and yet cannot quite contain it. About the business, which was accounting consultancy for small and medium businesses, which Edmund asked about with genuine interest, partly because it was interesting, and partly because asking was one of the ways you learned what a person actually was. She answered directly and without performance, telling him about the structure of the work and the clients she had, and the particular challenge of the current economic environment for small businesses, which she understood in detail and from the inside out. He asked follow-up questions. She answered them. He learned more in 20 minutes than he had learned in many much longer conversations. At one point he said, "You should have more clients who come from," and stopped himself, because the next word would have been something like, "my circle," or "people like me," and he could hear both of those before they arrived, and did not want to say either. She was watching him work through this, with the calm of a person who knows what is happening and is not going to rush it. "Larger organizations," he said. "You should be advising larger organizations. You would be very good at it." She considered him for a moment. "I am working on that," she said. "It takes time. Certain doors take longer." She did not look at him when she said it. She looked at her plate, and then back at the general table. He heard it. He heard it completely. "Yes," he said. "They do." The afternoon continued. The food was eaten, and the wine was drunk, and the table was loud and warm. And when Edmund left this time, he found that it felt less strange than the first time, both the leaving and the having been there. George was waiting. Edmund got in and sat back. "Good evening," George said, which was unusual for George. "Yes," Edmund said. "Good." George drove. The December streets were cold and lit and full of people finishing their Sundays. Edmund looked out the window and thought about a remark Oliver had made over the dessert. Something about how all the best conversations happened at this table, and how the table had heard everything at one time or another. He thought about what a table might hear if it had been listening for 30 years. He thought about what it might hear now, from a man who was slowly, and with more difficulty than he had expected, learning to sit at the right altitude. Not above, not surveying from a height, simply at. He looked out the window at December and thought, this is still just the beginning. Outside the city went by, all of it together, every kind of house and every kind of life and every kind of person and every kind of Tuesday, and Edmund Hartley looked at it properly, which was something he had not done in a very long time. He looked at it. He kept looking.